Tonight's program is the second supported by the Alan Rosenthal Fund for the Study of State Government and Politics. That fund honors a lifetime of work by the former director of Eagleton, a respected professor here for more than 40 years, and the unrivaled national expert on state government and state legislatures in particular. The Rosenthal funds are used by the Institute to broaden student exposure to state government and also to seek opportunities for building on Alan's work in meaningful ways. I often wonder these days what Alan would think and say if he were still with us, surveying the craziness and the conflict of the 2017, some of you are smiling knowingly, political scene. When I think of what he'd say, it's a certain number of favorite four-letter words. Alan believed strongly in the enduring institutions of government. He would likely share the despair some of us feel in witnessing the current paralysis and dysfunction in our governing institutions and political leaderships, and perhaps he'd also find cause for optimism in the constructive developments, actually, that have been cited in a recent report from the National Conference of State Legislatures, an organization that he had something to do with helping to build and with which he worked closely for many years. That report from a 3-year research project is called State Legislative Policymaking in an Age of Political Polarization. And I haven't heard what our guest speaker is going to address, but he might talk a little bit about that study since he was actually part of that study. While the researchers find significant polarization on the state level comparable to that experienced by Congress, they conclude that most legislatures, you'll be happy to know, most legislatures studied were actually able to negotiate differences and reach settlements on a host of major policy issues. And perhaps we'll learn more about that this evening, but it's certainly cause for a happy moment. Tonight, ever in search of good news on the governmental front, we're going to take a look at state government with our speaker under the not necessarily optimistic title. I'm sure this is what brought you out tonight, The State of the States in a State of Confusion. Professor Gary Moncrief has followed the scholarly trail blazed by Alan Rosenthal, and he's been an enthusiastic member of the Alan Rosenthal fan club for many years. Gary likes to use the story of his childhood, during which he lived in at least 4 different states, to explain how he came to appreciate the variations in state policymaking at a very early age and ended up directing his scholarly attention toward comparative state government. Gary got his undergraduate degree in political science from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and then his PhD from the University of Kentucky. Today, he's a University Foundation Research Scholar and University Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Boise State University, and we've spent some time today talking about life in Idaho. And you might want to look into that. He has published 6 books, more than 55 journal articles and book chapters on various aspects of state politics, especially state legislatures. His most recent books include State Legislatures Today, 2nd edition, Why States Matter, an Introduction to State Politics, Reapportionment and Redistricting in the West, and State Legislatures Today, Politics Under the Domes. He's also a frequent speaker at meetings and workshops for state officials on the practice side around the country. When he's not guiding PhD dissertations, he's guiding state officials around the country. Some of you may remember, some of you who are frequent guests here may remember that in addition to serving at Boise State University for over 30 years. Gary's been a visiting professor at the University of Washington and, more specifically, here at Rutgers In 2005, he was a visiting scholar at our Center for American Women and Politics, and he says he had the great good fortune of arguing with Alan Rosenthal on an almost daily basis. Whether arguing or not, Gary Moncrief has been a loyal friend to Eagleton, one who says yes, and I mean this very sincerely. Every time I send him an email and I say, hey, how about a visit in the fall? And how about coming east? And he says yes, immediately. We're proud to have him once again affiliated with us this year as a consulting scholar. We've asked him to walk or run us through, one, the relationship of the states with the federal government in the Trump era, two, the short-term electoral outlook. I want you to keep track of whether he covers all of this. Three, the run-up to the next U.S. Census. And four, the responsibilities states may face in the months and years ahead. That's a tall or a long, however you want to see it, order, but Professor Gary Moncrief is fully up to the task. He flew in here last night, and he's had a chance for a brief nap this afternoon, so he is no longer jet-lagged, and he's raring to go. Gary, welcome.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank all of you for being here. I see a lot of faces I saw before, and you guys actually came back. I'm just astounded. So thank you all. I also want to thank everyone at Eagleton for graciously having me more than once. And I not only want to thank Ruth, but I want to thank Danielle and Sarah for all they've done, because I can be a real pain when I'm doing something like this. I think Danielle probably got 18 different versions of a PowerPoint in the last week, and she just kind of stayed with it and let it roll. So I appreciate all of that. So Ruth just mentioned that she had sent me an email about 4 or 5 months ago and said, hey, why don't you come out again, and here's, maybe you can talk about these things. And I'm going to try to talk about most of those things. I'm not sure I'll hit all of them, but we'll try. What's that? Yeah. Well, yeah, you can try to keep count and see how we do. But when she asked me to do this, I thought, okay, we'll see what we can do with this topic, and what are we going to call this topic? And I settled on this particular title. I'm going to see if this works. It wasn't working this afternoon, and it's still not working, but just fine. I can use this. And here's the reason. The state of the states part of that comes from the fact that there's a book that was written, actually several editions of this book, that was called The State of the States, and it has a very close connection to Rutgers. Half a dozen or so Rutgers professors who were involved in this. Carl Van Horn, who's with the Blaustein School, was the editor of this particular book, and it was a great book. It was a book of basically 8, 10, 12 chapters about various aspects of state government and how, how the states were progressing, and there were a few policy chapters every year in that. I think the first one was probably written around 1984 or 5, I would guess. And then about every 4 years after that would be another one. And then there was a long period before the last one, which was in 2006. And there's a great lineup of Rutgers people who were involved in that. Carl Van Horn, obviously. Alan Rosenthal wrote the state legislative chapter in every edition of that book. Henry Raimondo was involved in a couple of editions. Henry Coleman wrote on state finances, Joel Cantor on health policy, Barbara Thalmore on elections and campaigns, and Stephen Thalmore. So there's a lot of connection with Rutgers, and that's basically the reason, and plus the fact I really liked the book. I always was excited when the new edition came out. I used the book in my classes, and it hasn't been written since 2006. So I thought, well, this will be a chance to kind of maybe nudge some people along and mention the state of the states. And the state of the states, particularly today, is clearly a state of confusion. So that's how we got to that title. Here's a few quotes from that 4th edition. I went back and read the first chapter of that book that Carl had written, the first chapter. And here's just a few quotes I pulled out. This is written in 2006, actually, which means, if you know anything about publishing, it was written in 2005 and was published in 2006, right? It says, reductions in federal aid to state and local governments are wreaking havoc on state budgets. States are being asked to assume important new responsibilities, generally with fewer resources than were previously available to remedy problems. And also, it noted that, quote, there's this continuous debate over health policy, including the decades-long struggle to remedy health insurance coverage gaps. Does any of this sound familiar to anyone in here? This is 11, 12 years ago, and it all applies today, and probably applies in even greater measure than it did at that point. One might think that nothing's happened in 11 or 12 years at the state level. That would be wrong. Think about what's happened in terms of the states and the federal relationship since this last edition of this book was written. Katrina, the 2006 Democratic wave in which they retook many state legislatures and Congress, the election of the first African-American president, the massive $800 billion American Recovery Act, the 2010 GOP wave election at both the national level and in the states, and of course, the 2016 election. A lot has happened since 2005 or 2006. So what I want to do tonight is talk about some of the things that have happened and perhaps why they've happened or how they've happened. And I'm going to do that with 4 quotes. So here they are. The first quote, it's a goat rodeo. Is this a term you're familiar with? Has anybody ever heard this term before? I was telling Cliff and Debbie last night, this is a term we use in the West a lot. It denotes chaos. It denotes the inability to get something organized. Have you ever tried to organize goats? That's the first one. I'll explain what that's about. And then the second quote is, this is a once-in-a-generation moment. Anybody know where that one comes from? We'll see. The third one is, I think it's going to be stormy, which I believe may be the understatement of the century. And finally, getting back to power requires gaining ground in the states. So we'll take these 4 quotes and see where we go with that. First of all, I want to talk about the fact that over those last 10 or 11 years since the 2006 edition of State of the States, the states really have been policy leaders in many ways. And obviously this had a lot to do with the fact that we had divided government at the national level and states were picking up the slack. Here's some of the quotes in various newspapers and media that you'd see around the country. Just because of the divided government and because of what we'll see in a little while, the unified government at the state level, Stateline.org wrote in 2014, without federal action, states move on long-term care. The Hill, which is a newspaper about Congress generally, but they increasingly write things about the states. Amid federal uncertainty, states confront opioid crisis. CQ roll call, states take on gas taxes and infrastructure. Frustrated by Congress, privacy advocates shift fight to the states. States forge ahead of feds to address retirement crisis. States lead the way in education innovation. So we had a period there, a decade, in which the states were actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting of the work, to coin an Alan Rosenthal phrase. So how's that different? Well, today we have unified government at the national level, but it's not united government at the national level. And this leads to a great deal of confusion. For example, the president has announced some months ago a $1 trillion infrastructure initiative, and the states waited and saw no evidence of that at all. Finally discovered, he said, that this was largely going to be a self-help program, meaning the states were going to wind up funding it themselves. And so about 8 or 9 states have already increased their gas taxes to help fund infrastructure. They're getting one signal over here, but not a consistent signal to go with that. We're getting mixed signals on health care, obviously. The state insurance exchanges in many states are increasing dramatically within the next few weeks, as we just discovered in my home state of Idaho, in part because of Congress's going back and forth on health care. Oklahoma has just raised their Medicaid, their health insurance, and they have specifically blamed Congress for that. Iowa's seeking a Medicaid waiver to deal with some programs there. So states are trying to deal with what they can. Congress, by the way, just let the CHIP program for children expire, which means that several states are going to essentially run out of money before the end of this year. Now that program will probably get reinstated at some point, but it didn't get reinstated in time to deal with the immediacy of the issue in some states. So it's basically been a goat rodeo for the first almost year now, 10 months or so. Let me back up for just a minute and mention something else about this. So there's so many different things, and there appears to be the inability to stay on target for very long. I was in the Denver airport yesterday, and the headline I saw in the Denver Post yesterday, the headline above the fold on the Sunday Denver Post was, I have to find it again now, it was Trump Twitter assault. That's the Sunday above the fold headline. We've got some problems in the country that need to be dealt with, and that's what we're seeing as the headline of the day. So I want to talk about partisanship and federalism. There's a couple of terms that are being used for this now. One of them is vertical polarization. We talk about polarization, and when we talk about it, we usually are talking about, well, the parties at the same level. So you're talking about the Republicans in Congress over here and the Democrats in Congress over here, or we're talking about, at the national level generally, or the voters here and the voters there. But one of the things that's starting to happen is we're seeing polarization that's not just horizontal at one level of government. Now it's vertical. Polarization has become a major part of the way federalism plays out in the states. So I want to talk a little bit about how we've gotten to that particular point. Tim Conlon, who is an expert on federalism, and he calls this polarized federalism, and that's a pretty good term for it as well. All right, so I'm going to show you some numbers here. You probably can't see these very well. I apologize. One of the great rules about PowerPoints is you never do tables and you keep things to 3 points. I just violate the heck out of that all night here. And it's only because I don't know how else to deal with this. All right, so let me explain to you what I've got here. And those of you over here, I know you can't see this, and I apologize for that. But what this particular chart is designed to show you is the years of unified control at the national government level. And I find this to be a stunning visual. I think I knew this in the back of my mind, but once I saw, it didn't really hit me until I saw this in front of us. So what I've done here is I've shown the years of unified national government control, and they're in bold, and the years that you have divided government at the national level are shown are a lighter color. So I don't know if you can see that very well. Oh, and it's also highlighted in a lighter color. And again, you can see this. I'm sorry you can't see this over here. But basically what this says is the following. From 1961 until 1969, until 1968, we had unified Democratic control, right? That's Kennedy, that's Johnson, that's a heavily Democratic Congress, House and Senate, right? Unified control among the Democrats. We know that, right? That's the Great Society program. You couldn't do something like the Great Society program unless you had unified control. And then we see another period between 77 and 1980, which is again unified Democratic control for 4 years. That's the Carter administration with the Democratic Congress. And then we see no unified control in the 1980s at all for either party. And then in the 90s, we see 2 years of Democratic control unified. That's 93 and 94. That's the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. And then we see 2 more years of Democratic control in 2009 and 10. That's the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And then we have between 2003 and 2006, and then again now, we see unified Republican control. So if you look at this, what you see, first of all, is that most of the states, most of the years, it's been divided government at the national level. Now, we know that. You and I know that, at least intellectually. We may not have actually seen the numbers before. 61% of the time, since 1961, we have had divided control at the national level. What's stunning to me about this is the partisan distribution over time. Between 1961 and 1980, the Democrats had unified control for 12 years, 8 years in a row in the 60s. Since then, in the last 40 years, the Democrats have only had unified control of the national government for a total of 4 years. Does that surprise you? It surprised me when I saw this. 2 years under Clinton and 2 years under Obama. Since 1961, the Republicans held unified control for 7 years, and all of them have been since 2000. So within this century, Republicans have had unified control much more than Democrats had at the national level. And as I said already, divided government at the national level has been far more prevalent than has unified government. Meanwhile, at the state level, it's a somewhat different situation. Now, this is a bunch of bar graphs, and what this is showing us is the number of states that at any given time have unified government. I suppose I should point out, and I just assume everybody knows this, but when I mean unified government, I mean the executive and both chambers of the legislature are from the same party, except, of course, in Nebraska, where they can't afford 2 chambers. They only have, that's not true, but they have a unicameral legislature there. So unified, some people call this trifecta government, that all 3 of those institutions are controlled by one party. What I want you to look at here, if you can see this, is the fact that, and this is not percentages, this is the number of states. So this shows us that if you go back to 1960, there were 31 or so states that had unified government. And then in 1962, there were about 32 states. In other words, most states were unified. And then that number goes down. And between 1984 and about 2004, so 20 years, we had a period there, 2 decades, where less than half the states had unified government. To flip that around, most states had divided government, like we have seen in Congress, at the national level for so long, right? But then that changes again. And what we see is, particularly, that number starts going up, and especially since 2010, we see that over 30 states have had unified government every time since then. So we've had this situation where, for the most part, we've had divided government at the national level, but increasingly we're having unified government at the state level. And to me, that explains something about why the states have had more policy power, or at least they've been doing more in the last few years. They're on the same track, whereas at the federal level, that hasn't necessarily been true. Now, this shows us the same stuff, the number of states with unified government. This only goes back to 1961, but this shows us the number of states that are Republican unified and the number of states that are Democratic unified in the last 25 or so years. And what I want you to notice is 2 things about this. The first one is the gap today between the red and the blue is huge, larger than anywhere else on that chart. That's because there are currently 25. This says 26 because I counted Nebraska in here and then realized I shouldn't and didn't want to go back into an Excel program. So count Nebraska however you want, because Nebraska really is unified Republican. They just pretend they're not. So because they have a nonpartisan legislature, although everybody knows it's Republican control. So either 25 or 26, depending on how you feel about Nebraska, are unified. And right now, Democrats fully control 6 states. And that's it. That's a huge disparity. The other thing I want to know, well, 2 other things. One is if you go back to 1991-92, you see that that situation was reversed, although the gap wasn't nearly as large. There were more Democratic states than there were Republican. I guess the biggest gap there would be 93, where it looks like it's about 18 Democratic states and only 3 unified Republican states in 1994. That's amazing. They were in worse shape then than the Democrats are now at the state level. The other thing I want you to notice here that I had never noticed before until I drew this chart out, look at the big slope increases for the Republicans and when they happen. There's 2 of them. The first one happens between 1993 and 95, right? That's 2 years into the Clinton administration. And the other one happens between 2008 and 2010. That's 2 years into the Obama administration. The same pattern happened both times. The Democrats were in control for 2 years, and not only did they lose seats at the national level, they got hammered at the state level as well. Now this chart, I must apologize for. This one's really busy. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to show these data, and this is the best I could do. And it's a nasty chart, I realize that. But let me explain to you why I thought it was still worth showing you, even though I'm embarrassed by it. So this only goes back to 91 and 92. So those of you over here who can't see this, what I'm showing is the years in 2-year increments. And then in the next column is the unified Republican, number of unified Republican states, kind of like the last chart, and then the unified Democratic states. And then what I've done is overlay that with the unified national government control, all right? So what this shows us, first of all, is if you look at this chart, you see that since 1991-92, as we already know from a previous slide, the Democrats only have had unified control at the national level twice, and in one of those times they had control of 18 states as well, and the other time they had control of 17 states, but that was very short-lived in both cases. The Republicans have had national unified control in 4 different electoral cycles since 1991. And for 3 of those, they didn't have a lot of states that were also controlled by the Republicans, about a dozen. But look at the 2017-2018 electoral cycle. The Republicans currently have, obviously, unified control at the national level, and they control 25 states. This disparity between the control of one party is the largest disparity we have seen in, I would guess, 90 years. So the quote that we started that section with was, it's an opportunity, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or it's a once-in-a-lifetime, that, thank you. She's taking notes. Good for you. Yeah, you'll pass the quiz that's at the end of the day. Say it again. It's a once in a lifetime. It's a once in a generation moment. It's a once in a generation moment. Who said that? Paul Ryan said that recently in talking about the Republican legislative package. We're trying to do a lot of stuff here. It's a once-in-a-generation moment. We've got unified control at the national level. We've got unified control in most of the states at this point. They see this as literally a once-in-a-generation moment, right? I'm almost through with charts, I promise you. I do want to show you this one as well. This is just looking at the unified Republicans now. And what this shows you is that it's been up and down over a long time. This one actually goes all the way back to 1946. Then what I wanted to show you was in the last 3 or 4 electoral cycles, how well the Republicans have done at the state level in addition to the fact that they're now at the national level, and how poorly they were doing for some period before that. So right now, we've got a situation that is literally historic. So the third thing here is what I call the fiscal squeeze. And this is really what I kind of want to talk about a bit tonight as well. And the quote that goes with this is a quote from a guy named Nicholas Johnson, who's with the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a kind of left-leaning think tank that deals largely with the budget issues. And his quote was, this is on a panel he was at the beginning of the Trump administration. This was back in January or so in Washington, D.C., and there were a number of analysts and people, and the comment he made was about how this is all going to affect the states. What he said is, I think it's going to be stormy. I think he's right, as we're going to see. So, you know, right now there's a great deal of media attention to a lot of issues that you and I see every day. Immigration issues, the Obamacare repeal efforts, environmental and energy issues, civil rights protections. There's lots of very serious, important things going on out there right now. They're all important issues. These tend to break along the left-right ideological line and partisan lines as well because of that. And in part because of those issues and the way they've broken out, and because of this situation with federalism that I just mentioned, polarized federalism, what we're getting is this. Tom Mann, just recently, a famous political scientist with the Brookings Institution, he said, what we are witnessing is war between the red and the blue. This is hardball, and it's distinctive from what we've seen before. And what he's talking about here largely is the fact that it appears that some of the programs coming out of the Republican administration or Congress, proposals in Congress, are specifically aimed at the Democratic states. You know, you guys saw some of the way the numbers were breaking out. For example, in the last effort to repeal, right, the Lindsey Graham bill, and how that seemed to be affecting some states more than others. You may have seen that just recently. I think it was this weekend. ICE did a lot of roundups, immigrant roundups in urban areas, mostly in Democratic states, right? There's evidence that the tax reform bill will affect some Democratic states more than Republican states. All of that seems to be in some way connected to the way partisanship and polarization has broken out between the national and state levels. And that's all very important, but it's stuff you and I are hearing every day. I don't need to repeat that to you. What I want to talk about instead is the fiscal part of this. Here's a couple of quotes. The first one is from the second edition of our book, Why States Matter. I was telling Ruth this at lunch today. There's a real quick story about this. We actually finished this book in October of last year, and the publisher was pushing us to get it out in the market. And we already had the page proofs done, which is pretty close to going to publication. And they wanted us to come out with it. And my co-author and I were saying, nah, you know, we have to wait until after the presidential election. You know, we don't think there's going to be any changes there, but you know, but the prudent thing to do would be to wait. And the publisher was, they didn't want to hear it. You know, they wanted to get the thing out. We finally struck a deal with them and said, okay, you can get the final page proofs to us a week after the election if you're going to have to. But we're ready to go, and we've already got everything with page numbers on it and indexed. And so if you change anything, you're going to have to pull things out and drop something back in there that's exactly the same number of words. So I've never had this experience before. And of course, the election happened, and we knew what parts we were going to have to change if the election happened in the way it did. And we had kind of pre-written some of that. But the thing is, we had to have it written in exactly the same number of words. I've never had to actually write in a way where I'm replacing something where the key factor is the number of words involved in it. So, but it worked. I mean, we did it. Thank goodness we didn't publish this before the election, or I'd look like a bigger idiot than I usually look. And so this first quote is actually, I think, from the preface where we're talking about that a little bit. It says, changes in fiscal federalism are almost certainly on the horizon. This means states will be faced with critical choices about the type and level of services they provide and the way that such services are funded. And that's exactly right. That's exactly where we are. It's exactly what we're going to see over the course of the next year or so. I don't see any way around that. I think it's part of the reality that states have to come to grips with, and they are well aware of this and have been for some time. It's not getting a lot of play. We didn't hear anything about the states really until just the last couple of weeks, right? About what's the effect of this on the states. Now we're starting to hear that, and we're going to hear a lot more of it, I think, in the next year. Stateline.org just did an analysis a couple of days ago. They said, so far, all the GOP health proposals would mean more decisions and less money for the states. Yeah, that's exactly what it's going to mean. And Ruth mentioned the NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures. Their fiscal analyst was quoted a couple of days ago in reference to, actually it wasn't in reference to Graham Cassidy, it was in reference to the tax reform bill. And what he said was, we are surprised and dismayed because of the state and local tax deduction component, which we'll talk about again in a minute. So what I'm saying is, I think this is very much the reality, and you know, all the issues out there that are so important, the social issues, et cetera, are very important, but eventually they all tie back to this and what effect this is going to have on the states. So I want to talk a little bit about states and budgets, and some of you in here know a lot more about state budgets than I do because you worked for the state, or you were a fiscal analyst, or you in some way had to deal with them, and so I apologize for this very short course. It's like 30 seconds on states and local budgets, but I think it's important for those of us who didn't work in that field or don't work in that field to make sure we're all on the same page here. First of all, states have to have a balanced budget. It's in the Constitution in a number of states. It's statutory in some states. Now, the reality is not all states deal with that in the same way. There are some states that fudge that, you know, and they don't really have balanced budgets. Some states are very firm on that. If you don't have a balanced budget by this date, we shut down state government functions. So it's, you know, there are worse consequences in some states than in others, but the reality is no state can deficit spend in the way that the federal government can deficit spend, right? So states are, even if they really don't balance their budgets, they are very much constrained by the resources that they have available to them in ways that's not true at the national level. One of the consequences of this is that when you have something like a severe recession, you know, I think we went through one of those recently. When you have a severe recession, states are immediately impacted by that because they've got less revenue coming in and they've got more people who need help. So state actions, which are essentially to to raise taxes at that point because they need more money. State actions are actually, they're pro-cyclical. They continue the economic cycle that you're in already, whereas the federal government, without a balanced budget requirement, can act in a anti-cyclical way. They can counter economic cycles by going into debt. That's exactly what happened, of course, with the recession. And the federal government sinking $800 billion into the states over the course of a few years, which saved Medicaid payments and education payments, and remember the term, shovel-ready infrastructure payments in a number of states? It was a bad recession. It was the worst economic time since the Great Depression for most states. But it was so much lighter than it would have been without that federal money coming in. And some states have yet to fully recover from that. So the balanced operating budget requirements is one of the things that you have at the state level that defines it and makes it different than the national government. For most states, the three main revenue sources today are personal income taxes, sales taxes, and federal aid. And a lot of people don't realize what a major part of state budgets federal aid is. It's about 31% to 32% of the state general fund, of the state operating budgets. That's a lot of money. And as you know, that's money that's not being given free. There are strings attached to that. And it's one of the reasons that Republicans and conservatives in particular don't like it, is because there are strings attached to it. But that's it. Those are the three primary revenue sources right now. And I'm telling you, and I think you already know this, that last one, the federal aid component, is going to get smaller. And that's going to put a serious crimp into some states, more so than already exist. Local governments, as you know, their revenue sources, basically three sources. One is property taxes, one is user fees, and the third one is intergovernmental aid. That is grants from either the federal or state government. Most of them are actually from the states. Well, guess what? If the state budgets are going to be limited, that's going to have a trickle-down effect to the local governments as well. And many of you in here work for local governments or municipalities, and you know what's coming if you understand this. There's going to be less aid there. So all of this is coming from the top down in this regard. And some states are already in bad shape, some of it of their own doing, some of it perhaps not. Illinois right now has $16 billion in unpaid bills because they did not come to a budget agreement for 2 years. Their bonding has been downgraded several times there, and it's basically junk status in some cases now in Illinois. Pennsylvania credit rating was just recently downgraded again for the same reason. Connecticut right now has a $1.5 billion shortfall. They're still without a budget. They were supposed to have a budget on July 1. It's not there yet. They passed a budget, the governor vetoed it. They're trying to work it out this week. If they don't get it worked out, there's an executive order from the governor that's likely to go into effect. And essentially, it's like, I don't remember the figure, but it's something like a 20% across-the-board cut, including aid to local governments, which is a big deal in Connecticut because local governments get a lot of their money from the state there. At least 9 Connecticut municipalities have been put on notice from Standard & Poor's and Moody's that they can expect a bond downgrade. There were a record number of states that missed their budget deadlines in 2017. They were late in getting their budgets done, and a couple of states still don't. Well, one state now doesn't. Illinois and Pennsylvania didn't get it done for a couple of years. 33 states had lower than expected revenue in fiscal year 2017. They projected X, they got Y, and they had to cut back or hold back or whatever. 19 states have yet to fully recover to pre-recession income levels. So a lot of states were already weakened. Medicaid costs are the fastest growing item in most state budgets. There are serious state pension underfunding in some states. We won't mention any names. But there are 4 states, I believe, where the state employee or teacher pensions are currently funded at 40% or less of what's required or what's going to be needed. That's very scary. The average state right now is at about 70 to 75% funding of the pension obligations. There's only about 2 or 3 states that are at 95 to 100% of their funding of their pension obligation. That's something coming down the road here for a lot of states that they have to figure out how to deal with. And most states don't have much in their savings accounts right now. They were depleted by the Great Recession. And states have been trying to build that back up, but their budgets haven't really come back in quite the way, or the revenues in some states that they want. So right now, most states have less than 6% of their annual operating funds in a rainy day account. So they're on a thin line in many places at this point. That's the good news. No, that's not true. That's very serious bad news for a lot of states. And I don't think most American citizens really understand how serious that is at this point. All right, so what to watch for in terms of the federal relationship in the next few months? This is just my shot at it. First of all, what about Supreme Court cases? The New York Times, I think, had a piece today about the new Supreme Court session. There's been a lot written in the last few months about what's coming up. States are very much looking at this Supreme Court and this particular term because there's a lot on the plate there that has to do with state and local governments and federalism. And one of the first things, in fact, this case is actually being heard tomorrow in Washington, D.C. before the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a case called Gill versus Whitford. This is that, as you may know by now, this rather famous, perhaps infamous, partisan gerrymandering case out of Wisconsin. As some of you know, the U.S. Supreme Court has never found a partisan gerrymander as unconstitutional. And there have been some blatant partisan gerrymanders, some by Republicans and some by Democrats. You know, whichever party has control of it tends to do it. It's not one party or the other. It's just that the most recent ones and the most effective ones have been done by the Republicans. Gill versus Whitford is this Wisconsin case, which was about as egregious gerrymander as you can possibly find. And if the U.S. Supreme Court can't find evidence of it here, I don't believe they will ever find a partisan gerrymander as unconstitutional. This is a very interesting case to watch. As I said, it's the hearing is tomorrow. The reason in the past that the U.S. Supreme Court has essentially said that they haven't found a partisan gerrymander is they haven't figured out how to measure it. You know, how do you determine that it really is a gerrymander? How do you assign some kind of value to this? And a number of people, mostly political scientists, I might add, have actually developed methods to measure gerrymandering, and they are presenting these measurements to the court and trying to convince the court that, in fact, it is possible to empirically determine a gerrymander, and if the court accepts that, it should change what's become a very ugly practice, again, on the part of both sides when whoever's got the pen, and that's distorting the lines in order to favor one party or the other. Partisan gerrymandering has been around forever, but it's gotten so much worse because the technology is so much better to do it. And again, I think the Wisconsin case is so clear just to the eyeball that if they don't find it here, they'll never find it. And people will give up even trying at this point. So this is a very important case for a lot of people who are concerned about gerrymandering, a very important case to follow. A second case is one you may know about. In the West, we'd never heard of this case, but this is a case that has New Jersey roots. This is Christie versus NCAA. It's a case involving the regulation of online sports betting. But what it's really about is this thing called the anti-commandeering doctrine, which is a principle that is set forth particularly by strong advocates of states' rights, which argues that the national government doesn't have the authority to force states to do the federal bidding, essentially. That is, that the feds can't make a state do something that's a purely federal action based on a purely federal law. They can't commandeer state resources to make you do this. Now, this is an interesting situation because there aren't very many anti-commandeering cases out there. There's only been, I think, 4 decided over the course of American history, but 3 of those are fairly recent. And I'm certainly no expert on this, but from what I've read, 3 of those are fairly recent. This has given a great deal of hope to the kind of states' rights, the real hardcore states' rights components. And so they see this as an important case down that road. And if you think about it, there are all kinds of implications for this. Think about it in terms of immigration, for example, or deportation, and the issue of I'm blocking the word here, the sanctuary cities and states, right? So for some people, this particular case, which has not a date hasn't been set yet, but they've accepted it to hear this term, is an important one. Then there's the case in Colorado called Masterpiece Cake Shop Limited versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission. This is a case involving, many of you know, the baker who refused to do a wedding cake for a gay couple that wanted to get married based on religious grounds. This case has also been accepted by the U.S. Supreme Court, although a date has not been set yet for it. And so that obviously has important implications as well. And then finally, a case that I think is really worth watching, which has not actually even been accepted yet by the court, but it's expected to accept it, and presumably we'll hear this case at sometime in the next year, is a case that's out of South Dakota that's a challenge to a case out of North Dakota. Is that confusing enough for all of us in here? South Dakota, North Dakota. This is the case, the Quill case, and some of you know what this is about. This is a case that goes back to 1992 in which the U.S. Supreme Court refused to allow states to collect sales tax on internet commerce unless the company had a physical presence in the state. Well, in 1992, maybe that made some sense. I'm not sure it even made sense then, but it might have made some sense to some people. But the world of commerce is a lot different in 2017 than it was in 1992. What is it, something like 40 or 50% of all commercial activity now occurs on the internet? Look at Amazon. So this is a case in which the states have been trying to get Congress to essentially rewrite the laws there about the ability of the states to levy sales taxes. And Congress actually has 3 bills in the hopper this year to try to deal with this, but now those are going to get put on hold because the case has gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. South Dakota wrote this bill. The legislature of South Dakota wrote this bill specifically designed for it to be declared unconstitutional at the state level so they could appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court level. They wrote this bill to get to the U.S. Supreme Court because they want to overturn this. And the general feeling seems to be it's likely to get overturned at this point. And this is good news for the states because this will mean a revenue source that they are going to desperately need. It's not going to solve all their problems, but it will help a bit. Now, and as you know, some large corporations have already started to pay the sales tax in states. I think largely because they saw what was coming. They knew this was coming down the road, but still, states are missing out on, the estimates are $50 to $60 billion a year in sales tax on internet sales. So I think those are the 4 cases that are going to be particularly interesting to watch before the U.S. Supreme Court that have a bearing on the states at this point. What about congressional action? Well, there it is. It all looks like stuff we've seen there in the last few weeks in one way or another, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. Tax reform is very much on the agenda. Why? Because, as Paul Ryan said, it's a once-in-a-lifetime, right? Yeah, exactly. So we're going to see it for sure. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. You guys that read the paper like I do, you know there's this kind of blocked out thing there, and we don't know exactly what it's going to look like eventually. The House Ways and Means Committee will start drafting out the legislation, I think, probably by the end of this month. The hope on the part of the Republican Congress and the President is to have something to the Senate by the end of the year. We'll see. You know, so far, what do we know about that legislative process? It's a goat rodeo. So we'll see how that continues and how it goes. But certainly that's the intention. Now, the key thing for us people who are interested in state and local governments, of course, two things. One is what's known as the municipal bond tax-free status, you know, which is if you buy municipal bonds, you don't have to pay income tax on the proceeds, right, on the interest that you earn, and that's been a very important tool for local governments, especially, but states as well, in selling bonds, because it puts them in a more competitive advantage when they are in competition with corporate bond seekers, right? Because you've got the tax break on the municipal bonds. And for years now, there's been talk on the part of some people in Congress to do away with that it's basically just a giveaway. And every year, the National Municipal League and the state and local lobbying efforts have been able to hold that off. And the word is this probably isn't going to get implemented in this new tax reform bill. But who knows? You know, what we hear right now from people in Congress is we can save this. This will be okay. But you know, it's a goat rodeo, folks. I'm not willing to see that until the rodeo's over. I'm not willing to take that to the bank. The other thing is the state and local tax, what's known as SALT deduction. I know you guys have heard about this. It was in the news a lot last week. It was when they rolled out the tax reform bill, this was one of the things that got a lot of play. And one of the reasons it got a lot of play is because it has a major effect on states, and especially some states. And this is one of those some states. This is the aspect where if you pay income tax in your state, that you get to write that off or deduct that off of your federal income tax. And there is a move on the part of some people in Congress to eliminate that is in fact another giveaway. And this is going to be fought very, very hard by states and local governments, because local governments realize that they have a lot to lose by this as well. If this were to pass, if the tax reform was to pass with this included, with the elimination of the deduction, it would be, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of the effect it would have. So it's a major deal. And if I had to guess, I would guess that we're probably going to see that backed off of in Congress. But again, who knows? One of the things we have to keep in mind here is that because of the structure of the federal budget process, if Congress passes a reform that increases the budget deficit, they have to deal with that in some other way, meaning they have to cut spending somewhere else or find some other revenue stream to plug up that deficit increase that they've created. And this is the reason that SALT is being looked at, is if we're going to reduce income taxes over here by this amount, we're going to have to find some other way to plug that gap. And the SALT was the first thing they looked at. Oh, well, if we just don't let them do that, that'll plug up a good deal of that. So the lobbying effort on the part of state and local governments on this is going to be substantial. And this actually affects not just some states, it affects all states that have an income tax, and not all states do, but most do. And it especially affects states where you have a lot of people, you either have a high income tax rate or you have people who are fairly wealthy and are paying a lot in state income tax. New York, Connecticut, New Jersey are three of the states. California are states that are high on that list. By the way, you notice again that those tend to be blue states, right? Yeah, so we're back to that vertical polarization thing again. This is going to be one to watch closely for a whole host of reasons, but from the point of view of the states, this is a very serious component to what's going on. This is where that quote, "We are shocked and dismayed," from the National Conference of State Legislatures, it was in regard to that. You know, there will be another try to repeal Obamacare of some sort. You know, we already know that if that was to happen in one form or another, it's going to have downstream effects on insurance exchanges and obligations that states have. There's just no way around that I see it. And this effort to turn Medicaid into a block grant. That was talked about well before the election. We knew it was coming, especially once Trump won the presidency and the Republicans maintained control in the House and Senate. We knew this was coming. We just heard about it, we being the American public, you know, recently in a kind of backdoor way because of the second effort on Obamacare, which this was not part of the first effort. But this will be back. Be it part of the Obamacare repeal or not, it will be back. It'll probably come back separately, I would think. And this has long-term consequences for the states. The argument that's going to be used to sell this is, yeah, we're going to reduce the amount of money, but the states are going to have the flexibility to deal with it as they want. And there is some attractiveness to that argument, but you know, let's keep it into perspective here. Yeah, you're more flexible, but with less money to be flexible with, right? We saw this with the temporary assistance for needy families, the movement, you know, to end welfare as we know it under the Obama administration. We saw this move from an entitlement to a block grant, basically. The difference is this is a much, much bigger program than the AFDC, TA, and F program ever was. And it's continued to grow, and part of that's just simple demographics, among other things, among a number of program changes over time. And then there's efforts among the states to keep an eye on as well. My goodness, I'm a chatty person, aren't I? So you always have to keep an eye on this. Now, on the East Coast, you guys don't have to pay much attention to this because most eastern states don't have the initiative process. In the West, it's a big deal. We have the initiative process whereby people can, you know, gather signatures, and if you get enough signatures together, you can get something on the ballot for a direct vote. Direct democracy, we call it. We have that in almost all of the Western states, and some of the Western states use it a lot. California usually has 20 or 25 what they call propositions on the ballot. You know, a lot of what's happened in the last few years that is innovative policy, good or bad, is policy that was made not through the legislature but through the initiative process. Almost all the marijuana laws changes in the United States. A lot of the assisted suicide laws, the gay marriage laws first were in that vein. There's a lot of things out there that first happen in some states through the initiative process. And so I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. One of these, which is not the initiative process, but is something called the Article 5 Convention Call. You guys know about this? This is Article 5 of the Constitution. Essentially, the states can call for a constitutional convention. And there is a lot of talk, particularly in my neck of the woods, about this because there are a lot of people that want a balanced budget at the federal level. Now, I am an economic conservative, and I understand the argument for that. And I believe that we need to do something about the budget deficit at the federal level in the United States. But this, combined with what I just told you about state fiscal situation, is a recipe for real disaster. If a convention call was successful and a balanced budget requirement was put in the Constitution, it would not affect just the national government. It would have a major effect on state and local governments as well. So this is something to keep an eye on. There are currently 27 states that have passed this call at this point, usually in the form of a it's not law, but it's, a recommendation, a resolution. And they only need another 7 or 8 states to have the requisite number to do this. And the proponents of this Article 5 call believe their intent is to push this very hard the next 2 to 3 years. They think that within the next 2 to 3 years they may get the requisite number. Now, there's a lot of other things going on there. Some people are, even a lot of conservatives are very leery of this because of the possibility of a quote-unquote runaway convention. And once you call this, what can happen? It's not clear. We've never had one called in the United States in this way. There's a lot of angst about this particular movement, but it's there, and in parts of the country it's very real. Certainly it's very real in my part of the country. Most of the western states have passed this, and obviously a number of other states have as well. So we'll see where that's going, but I wouldn't just ignore it. I mentioned, I'm going to skip over that second one, come back to it, actions in initiative states. The 24 states that have the initiative process, you never know what they're going to do. There's some crazy stuff that comes out of those states. My state's one of them that has this initiative. But there are some things that could be done in the next couple of years through the initiative process that are going to have a direct effect and challenge to the national government that are going to put federalism back into this contentious mode, or I should say back into it, that is going to exacerbate what's already there. One of them is whether or not more states pass marijuana laws. Right now, so far, the national government has chosen not to really go there, but I don't know that that's going to last much longer. We'll see. But that sets up a very big fight between the national government and some very big states, like California, among others. And if other states do this through the initiative process, that might be the tipping point in terms of a challenge from the national government to states' ability to do this. Because as you know, there's a federal law opposed to marijuana. But states have been doing it for years anyway, and kind of ignoring that, largely because of divided government. But I don't know if that's going to last at this point. We'll see. I have no idea. And it's also very possible that some states, like California, are going to pass through the initiative process much more stringent environmental laws, which puts them in direct conflict with the federal government as well, and on perhaps immigration laws, and perhaps on issues involving LGBT or whatever. There's a lot of possibilities for states to push the pedal down a little more in terms of this contention right now. So all of those are things to keep an eye on out there. And I want to mention this other thing that I'm calling efforts at obstructive federalism. I'm not quite sure where that term came from. I may have dreamt it one night, or I may have picked it up from something I've read. But basically what we're talking about here is the increasing effort on the part of states to sue the national government, either the president's executive orders or congressional acts, to get it to court, to litigate. And these are kind of tests of states' rights versus the national government. And this has become a very common thing, really. I mean, it's always been around, but it's been much more prevalent in the last, I would say, 20 years, maybe in the last 10 or 12 years. You may remember, for example, that we saw a lot of, under the George W. Bush administration and No Child Left Behind. There was a reaction to that and a suit, lots of lawsuits from Democrats, largely, right? Claiming what? States' rights, right? And then under Obamacare, there were all kinds of lawsuits from Republicans claiming what? States' rights. And now we're seeing Democrats again challenging executive orders from President Trump and will eventually congressional laws claiming what? States' rights. One of the things that I always like to remind people is that when it comes to federalism and states' rights, we are all hypocrites. And right now, the Republican majority in Congress, which has been screaming about states' rights all through Obamacare, it doesn't seem to be quite on the tip of their lips the way it was, or tip of their tongue the way it was. Instead, it's now the Democrats. And one of the ways this has become very interesting is the role of state attorneys general in this. Within the last decade and a half, state attorneys general have become much more aggressive in suing the national government. Now, this was especially true under when Obama was president. You had Republican attorneys general who were basically making a whole career out of suing the Obama administration. The Texas attorney general, Paxton, I think his name is, the Oklahoma attorney general, the Kansas attorney general, all of them were suing, trying to block executive actions a great deal. Now, it's the Democratic attorneys general that are doing the same thing under Trump. What's the attorney general in Massachusetts name, Debbie?
Laura
Healey. Yeah, Laura Healey has become pretty well known for her efforts to block Trump actions or congressional actions. The California Attorney General Xavier Becerra has challenged Trump on almost a daily basis. So we're seeing more and more of this all the time. And I think that's an important thing to keep an eye on as well. And so that brings us to looking toward the election in 2018. And this brings us to the last quote. The last quote I have here is a quote by a guy named Greg Speed, who is a National Democratic Redistricting Commission member. And he said, quote, "Getting back to power in Washington, D.C. requires gaining ground in the states." Well, hello, Democrats. Where have you been? Because one of the things that I think we have to lay some blame where it belongs is the fact that Democrats, as a group, have not understood why states matter in the way that Republicans have. Republicans figured this out 20 years ago. And they have been building this power at the state level since then. Newt Gingrich was critical to that. He was recruiting people to run as Republicans in state legislatures in the 1980s and building that bridge up from the bottom up. And they have been extremely successful in using states as a power base to get to the national level. And it seems to me that Democrats just have never quite understood that as well. It's always been about the national government. And that has really come back to haunt them at this point. And so now they've figured it out. It's a little late in the game, but it's better late than never. The only person at the Democratic level, I think, that really had figured that out and made an effort at it for a while, and then it kind of went away after a few years, was Howard Dean. Remember when he was the head of the National Democratic Party, and he said, we're going to make an effort in all 50 states. And a lot of Democrats said, what, you nuts, right? And he made this effort, and remember those charts? The Democrats did pretty well there for a few years, and then it's, for what reasons, I don't know, some of you may know, that kind of went away. I think it went away once the Democrats got control of the presidency again and went, oh, yeah, well, we're good. Yeah, we're good now. So I think this is an important component. The future of the Democratic Party really is at stake in these gubernatorial elections coming up in 2018. That's a quote from Elizabeth Pearson, the executive director of the Democratic Governors Association, a recent quote, August of 2017. Democrats recognize they've got to get back in the game, and the place they're most likely to get back in the game quickly is at the state level. Now, a lot of people are talking about, we've got 2018 elections coming up in Congress. Unless it's an extraordinary wave, it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to regain. I mean, let's just face facts. The Senate, the numbers that are coming up in the Senate do not favor the Democrats. They have to defend more tough seats than the Republicans do. The Republicans have a lot of incumbents coming back. The time for the Democrats to regain the Senate was 2016, and it didn't happen. Came close, but didn't happen. This next election is very, very difficult for them in terms of regaining the Senate. And just because of sheer numbers, it's hard in the House. I wouldn't say it's impossible. A wave election can do amazing things, but wave elections don't happen very often. So it's going to be hard, not impossible, but hard for the Democrats to regain. What some Democrats are increasingly coming to grips with is the fact that their best shot at getting back in the game is going to be at the state level. That's why Elizabeth Pearson says the future of the Democratic Party really is at stake in these gubernatorial elections. There are a lot more currently Republican-held governorships than there are Democrat that are coming up, and a lot of those are going to be open seats. The reason they're going to be open seats is that in 2010, there were a lot of Republican and a lot of Tea Party Republican governors who were elected in that anti-Obama wave, and they are now term limited out. So there is an opportunity at this point. 34 Republican governors, including about a dozen who were elected in 2010 as Tea Partiers, will be termed out and will be termed out in 2018. There's 34 total. They're not all running for they're not all up for election, but most of them are, because most governors' races, as you know, are not in the presidential year. They're in the off year. There are 15 Democratic governors. There's one independent governor. I was going to ask you as a test who it was, but I stupidly gave away the answer there. It's Alaska. Right? There you go. There's the visual. This is the number up in 2017, 2018. I've included 2017 because have you heard there's a couple of governor's races this year? No, okay. One of them is somewhere close to here. And the other one, of course, is in Virginia. And then the rest of them will be next year. So between this year and next, there are, 38 gubernatorial elections. Those are, as I always used to tell my freshman class, gubernatorial elections, that's when we elect a goober. 27 Republicans out of 38. There's a big opportunity, is the point there, right? And a lot of those are going to be open seat. It seems to me that the most likely shifts are here. The most likely chances of going from a Republican to a Democratic governor are obviously here, New Jersey, Nevada, New Mexico, apparently any state that begins with an N, Illinois, where you have a Republican governor right now in a very ugly 2-year budget fight, there. It's just been awful. Michigan, and maybe Florida. Now, I'd say Florida is kind of on the outside of that, but possible. Again, it depends so much. We're a year away. Who knows what's going to happen in the next year? The goats might get out of the fence. There's lots of things that can happen. I keep hitting that thing. There's lots of things that can happen in the next year that can change all this. But right now, it looks like you have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 very legitimate possibilities of flipping, and another maybe 1 or 2 other maybes that I'm not focusing on here. But I think those first ones are, good, solid opportunities at this point in time. We'll see. On the other hand, I think there's a couple of cases that could go the other way. Connecticut right now is just a mess, quite frankly, in terms of their budget. Their governor is not running again. Malloy is not running again. That's going to be an open seat. Republicans are actually surging in Connecticut. They have taken, they're tied in the Senate now. I mean, 4 years ago, it was a pretty heavily Democratic legislature. The Republicans are tied in the Senate and only about 3 or 4 seats away in the House right now. So it's tightened up between the two parties there. It's a governor who's pretty unpopular at this point, and he's not running again. And so it's possible in Connecticut. I mean, I don't, you know, right now I would say the chances are the Democrats will hold it, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on it. That's the governor calling right now to tell me he's not unpopular. And then what about legislatures? Currently, Republicans control 68 of the 99 legislative chambers. That's a lot. That's close to 70% of all the legislative chambers out there, including outright control of both chambers in 32 states. That's a lot. The Democrats control both chambers in 14 states right now. Now, term limits exist in 15 states, and this year, term limits are going to term out more Republicans than Democrats. So this is a year in which the Republicans are going to wind up having a number of people, I think it's about 270, that are going to be termed out of various state legislatures out there. So Democrats can see some hope there, I would think. Here's the, you know, there's the numbers I just gave you, 32, 14, and 3. There's 3 chambers that are split. One party controls one chamber and the other party the other one. Term limits, I just mentioned 15 states. 271 legislators are termed out, are Republicans in those states that have term limits. Moreover, the president's popularity, the president's party almost always loses seats in state legislatures in the off year. Those charts I showed you before, you realize all those big changes were occurring in the off year of the presidential election, and it was all against the president, right? Obama lost huge numbers of state legislative seats. George W. Bush lost huge numbers of state legislative seats in 2006. So there is that trend that we see that happens more, and it seems to be becoming greater over time, that people seem to be voting in state legislative races based on the party affiliation of the president, which is not a very rational thing to do, but it seems to be happening a lot at any rate. But here's the downside of all that. About 40% of state legislative seats out there around the country aren't contested at all in the general election. They're safe for one party or the other. So who cares if it's an open seat? If it's still a Republican seat, you know, they can run a donkey in a win, right? And the same thing, a donkey wouldn't make sense on the Republican side, but that's a different story. But you understand what I'm saying, is that there are so many safe seats out there for one party or the other that it doesn't matter. You just can't make them competitive under the current situation. So I think that's, you know, kind of the other side of that. Nonetheless, Democrats are likely to pick up seats. I don't think they're likely to pick up chamber control in very many places. It's one thing to say you pick up 8 seats. It's another thing to say that was enough seats to put you into the majority, right? And that's what really matters in legislatures, is being in the majority. Particularly in a polarized world, being in the majority is what it's about. Right or wrong, good or bad. That's the way it seems to work these days. So I don't think they're going to pick up chamber control in very many places. Why? Number one, most lower chambers, houses, have a lot more safe seats than state senates do, just the nature of the beast. And where lower chambers are closely divided right now, which is in a few places, those are already Democratic. And the examples I use here is in Connecticut, the House is controlled by the Democrats, but it's very narrow now. And in Maine, the same thing is true. So here's what I think are the chambers that are most likely to flip. If the election were held today, it's not, by the way, going to be held today. But if it were, these are the senates, and this is where I think you're more likely to see some chamber flips just because the numbers work better. They're smaller, it doesn't take as many seats to change hands. Right now, in Arizona, it's 17 Republicans and 13 Democrats. Arizona is a state that's a Republican state generally. You wouldn't normally think this is going to happen, but if you've been paying attention, there are some elements in Arizona that are, you know, kind of rethinking a few things. And it's possible I would say, that the Democrats could gain control. Not likely, but possible. Colorado is an 18-17 split right now. All you got to do is flip one seat, and you change party control in Colorado. Same thing is true in Maine, 18-17. And in Minnesota right now, same thing, 34-33. And those are all cases where Republicans are currently in control, but it wouldn't take very much for Democrats to gain in those seats. On the other hand, you've got Connecticut, 18-18. You've got Delaware, which is 10-11 for the Democrats. You've got Nevada, which is 9-10 for the Democrats. And you've got Oregon, which is 13-17 for the Democrats. So a slip up 1 or 2 seats there could change the other way. Not as likely to happen as the first scenario, but possible. All right, so here's the bottom line. Barring events that lead to a wave election, we can expect the Democrats to make some modest gains at the state level. This is not something that you do overnight. You've got to be in this for the long haul at the state level. The Republicans have understood that very well. Colorado, Illinois, New Mexico, Nevada, Maine, New Jersey are the most likely states in my mind to move from divided government to unified democratic. So the Democrats could pick up about 5 or 6 unified state governments. Florida and Michigan are the most likely to move from unified Republican to divided. All you got to do, they're both heavily Republican in the legislature, but the Democrats have a shot at the governorship there, which changes the dynamics a lot. And I want to mention attorneys general again. About 30 of them are up for election next year. There's 50 attorneys general, but only something like 40 or 41 of them are elected. They're actually appointed in some states. I think they're appointed in New Jersey, right? Yeah. But in most states they're elected. I think about 30 of them are up, and most of those, 18 or 19 of those, are Republicans. So there's some opportunity there for the Democrats. And the Democrats are making a real effort at the attorney general level. They're trying. This is one of the places where they've recognized they need to focus because of the growing role of attorneys general in the federal relationship at this point. And interestingly, the Democrats are making a real effort to find good quality women attorney general candidates. And there's a lot of them out there, and the Democrats are being very aggressive about trying to pick that up. All of this is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which, and finally I'm getting to the end here, Ruth. Finally. You didn't think it would ever happen. Not the least of which is reapportionment and redistricting, which is not that far away. Republicans were much, much, much better prepared for this in the battle in 2010, and it showed. They were prepared. They had a battle plan. They had something called Red Map, which was a strategy to win state legislatures in 2010, because the legislature that is elected in 2010 is the one that sets the reapportionment or redistricting by 2012, right? The census happens in 2010, which means the census data isn't released to the legislature in 2011. They usually do the redistricting in 2011 or early 2012. That means the legislature that's doing that is the legislature that was elected in 2010 in most states, right? Republicans were all over that. And it happened to be that was the off year after a new Democratic. It was perfect. It was perfect timing for them. And I keep doing that just to keep a couple of people awake. It was perfect timing for them. They gained a lot of state legislatures that they had not normally gained, including Wisconsin. And they had a plan for implementing redistricting that would be to their advantage. And they made great progress in that. And the Democrats are trying to do the same now. And they've got a plan. They're raising a huge amount of money. They have an organization that's developed to do it. Guess what? That horse was out of the barn 10 years ago, but better now than never, right? Finally, I'm almost done, I promise. Speaking of reapportionment, you had asked me to say something about the census and what's likely to happen. Well, here it is in all its glory. And I'm not only giving you the upcoming census and reapportionment, I'm giving it to you all the way back to 1932 because that's the kind of guy I am. What this shows you is the number of House seats, seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, held by regions of the country. So I've broken this down into 4 regions: north, east, west, south. These and the regions are based on, I think I used the Council of State Governments regions, so it's a fairly legitimate, I don't know if it's legitimate, it's a fairly standard way to do it. And again, I'm sorry you can't see this in some places, but what this shows us is, first of all, well, let's start with this. This is the West, the Western states. In 1932, all 13 Western states together had 42 or 43 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. That's it. California today has 54. But the entire West only had 42 or 43, and obviously that's one of the areas of great growth in the United States. The other area of great growth is the South. The South was basically flat from 1932 until the invention of air conditioning, and then boom! That's only mildly untrue. And since then, big increase, and you know where that's been, right? Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, basically, right? So big increase there. Now, except for the West Coast, the Washington, Oregon, California, most of those areas are not particularly amenable to the Democratic Party at this point, right? Some more good news for you Democrats in the crowd. Right? These 2 lines, and it looks like one line because they are on exactly the same path, is the East and the West and the Midwest. They're losing seats in the House, and of course, it's not that they're losing population; it's that we're not throwing any more chairs into the House of Representatives. So if somebody gets a seat over here, somebody else has got to lose one. And that has been the East and the Midwest, and they have lost a huge number of seats. Basically, either of those regions or each of those regions had somewhere between 125 and 130 seats. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry over there in the other room. We're serving cocktails over here in this room. But it's all out now. I'm sorry you missed it. So at any rate, so the Midwest and the Southern states had between 120 and 130 seats in each of those regions in 1932, and now they're each down to about 80. A huge regional shift in the U.S. House of Representatives over time. And of course, that means not only a shift in the U.S. House, it also means a shift in a little thing we like to call the Electoral College. Right? That trend continues. And I've thrown in here the projections for 2020. Those are the last data points on this. And you can't really tell much by that, but you can from here. Here's the likely winners and losers in the U.S. House in the next reapportionment. The seat gains, Texas is anticipated to gain at least 3 seats in the U.S. House. At least 3, maybe 4, but 3 for sure. That's remarkable. Florida is anticipated to gain 2 seats. And then there's a bunch of states that are likely to gain 1, North Carolina, Arizona, Colorado, Oregon, maybe Montana. If Montana gains a seat, it would be one of the ones that Texas, we think, might gain. So, but if you look at that, where are those places? It's all South and West, right? So this trend continues. Seats to be lost. Illinois will lose at least 1, possibly 2, probably 1. Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, you see a pattern here? All Midwest. Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, West Virginia, and the only state that doesn't follow pattern here is Alabama, a southern state, but they're likely to lose 1 seat. So I think that's what we're probably looking at in terms of the U.S. House in 2020. So finally, last thing, I'm thinking, what would Alan say? You had raised this, Ruth, earlier, what you thought Alan would have to say, and I wrote down what I thought he would say. First of all, I think he would say, I think he would agree with me. I hope he would. Not because I like what I'm saying, just because I like it when Alan and I are on the same page. I think he would probably say much the same as I have said. He would just do it with a lot fewer charts and a much more colorful language, as you pointed out. I think he would also probably say something insightful about how the current situation expands the role of governors. You know, Alan was a state legislative guy, but at the end he was starting to write about governors more, and it seems to me, particularly in this polarized vertical federalism thing, that governors are in a much better position than legislatures. Legislatures aren't designed to turn on a dime. Governors can do that a lot easier than state legislatures can. So I think he would probably take the opportunity to talk about the importance of governors at this point. And finally, I think he would then go off and write a book about attorneys general. Thanks.